Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on planet Earth. It's a turbulent, fast-forward planet, and we're connecting via the wonders of the internet and social media, and wherever you're watching this. You know that there's great potential, and actually great concrete progress has been made in online communication. It's why Skype is scientists. You can think of 1,000 ways that we're using the internet and all this connectivity to be productive and to boost community capacity for resilience and to spread ideas and for scientists to engage with each other in creative commentary. And then there's the dark side. And the dark side is very dark sometimes. Some of this predates the social media landscape. In 2009, I had the privilege of Rush Limbaugh telling 15 million listeners that he suggested I kill myself because I was talking about population. And so this concept doesn't necessarily only exist on the internet, but there's the amplification process here. There's this swarming process. There's trolls. There's professional dissemblers and diffusers and attackers. And there's people who are just culturally attuned to make the worst of any situation, it seems. And at the same time, there are scientists who are diving into this arena. We're here today to meet with Viktorya Vilk, who is at Penn, a writers' organization that's the U.S. version has existed since 1922, long before the internet, to protect writers' rights and particularly free expression. So Viktorya will come on in a second. They've created, I noticed this recently, an online field manual. It's kind of like Dumbledore's Army Defense Against the Dark Arts. And Viktorya does trainings so far, mostly for journalists and for writers. And so I had this idea, well, I know so many scientists who've dived into this public facing arena and who are, again, doing wonderful work to make progress. You've seen it, Catherine Hayhoe and Jacquelyn Gill, and who you'll meet in a minute, Kate Marvel here at Columbia and at NASA. And Angie Rasmussen, who's a virologist at Columbia, will be with us. There's, again, a great aspect to all this. Carl Zimmer has made lists. There's lists of dozens of scientists making a difference in the social media landscape. But today we're going to talk about self-defense. And not just self-defense. There's also defense of others. So here, we're going to learn right away. Viktorya, if you can come on, I'm going to add you here. It's great to have you here. I hope you're safe and relatively sane wherever you are in the world. Trying. I know each day we can only try. And in a minute, you'll all meet some good friends of mine, Angela, Kate, and Jacqueline as well. But we thought we'd start with just sort of a little bit of what is this? What's your sense of harassment and what to do about it? Again, these tools and techniques, initially, you've been refining as they relate to writers. And here's the website is online-harassment-fieldmanual.penn.org. Remember, if you're watching, this will all be archived instantly, so you can scroll back to it. And you have all these tools and techniques. You've been doing workshops of various kinds. So, Viktorya Vilk, good to have you here, and maybe you can explain a little bit more about what it is you do and why.
Gladly. So let me go ahead, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to share my screen because I'd like to, let's see. I'd like to show you folks a few slides.
Great.
Let me know if you can see it.
Not yet. Oh, here it is. Hold on, I'll add it. There we go.
Terrific.
Yep, we're there.
Excellent. So thank you very much. So my name is Viktorya, and I am the Program Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at Penn America, where I do a lot of work around the issue of online abuse. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are, as Andy said, an organization that's been around for almost 100 years, and we primarily work with writers and journalists in the US and around the world, but we actually do a lot of work with universities and academia too. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk to you about this issue today because I feel it's absolutely critical, not just for writers and journalists, but for scientists and public health experts. And I would say especially in this moment, but actually I think that's just true all the time. And, frankly, I think it's really important for society and public discourse at large. So I find in my own experience that to have a productive conversation about online abuse and to figure out what to do with it, the place to start is to make sure we're all talking about the same thing and to have a shared language to describe what's happening to people and the impact it has. And so when we at Penn, we sort of come up with a definition. When we talk about online abuse, we're talking about the severe or pervasive targeting of an individual or group in an online setting through harmful behavior. And those two words, severe and pervasive, are really important. It's rooted in the beginnings of legal language around this issue. But severe is important because even one act of online abuse, if it's something like doxing, which involves putting your, let's say, home address online, can be incredibly destructive, even if it's just one tweet or one Facebook post. Pervasive essentially is the other end of that coin. So one individual insult or comment, or even just spam that you're sent, might not be a big deal, but if you are bombarded with thousands or tens of thousands of those messages, they can have a real impact on your ability to do your work. And so the term is broad because it's an umbrella term that involves kind of ever-evolving tactics. This landscape moves really fast, and I'm going to talk through just a few of the tactics that we see most often, because I think it's really important to have a language to describe what's happening to you. And to know, oh, that's abuse and that shouldn't be happening. That's not allowed. It's a violation of terms of service. It shouldn't be happening to me, but it is, and I want to be able to name it something. So, hate speech is pretty self-explanatory, but it's essentially speech that targets someone for their identity, their gender, their race, their sexuality, etc. Threats, also pretty self-explanatory, right? Threats of physical violence for women and women journalists, women scientists is often threats of sexual violence. Dogpiling is essentially when there are so many people piling onto one person. You've got such an avalanche of negativity and hate and messages that it's hard to navigate them. Doxing I mentioned, but it's the publishing of private sensitive information like your home address, your cell phone, where your kids go to school, your social security number. And it is exactly that moment when all of this there's this kind of myth around online abuse that it's somehow not real life. But I think when you're talking about doxing, suddenly something clicks in people's minds and they realize that this is a false boundary we're placing between the internet and real life. The internet is real life now, right? And especially now that we're all home using Zoom and virtual streaming and everything else for everything, this is sometimes the entire kind of facet of our professional lives in this moment. A few other kind of things I'll point out. So impersonation, I think this happens a lot, not just to journalists, but to scientists. It's when somebody creates a fake account with your face and your name and uses it to spread vile or defamatory or kind of appalling content to embarrass or humiliate you or discredit you or get you fired in some cases. Message bombing is when you're kind of swamped with email messages or voicemails that render your account unusable because you can't get through all the crap that's in there. Non-consensual intimate imagery is a really nasty tactic that, again, is often used against women, but it's this distribution of private, in some cases totally manufactured, sexually explicit images without the consent of the person in them, and is illegal in, I think, over 40 states now, but not all 50 yet. And Zoom bombing, this is my point about ever-evolving tactics. Like, who of us would have ever even thought Zoom bombing was a thing back in February? And now we were all thinking about, what happens if this meeting that I'm running gets, bombed by someone who starts spreading hate speech? So those are some of the tactics. The problem is enormously pervasive. This is a very recent study that came out of YouGov and ADL that found that over 44% of Americans have experienced online harassment. A study from several years ago found that over 66% had seen other people being subjected to it. And the kind of perhaps most important issue is that not everyone is equally targeted, nor are they targeted for the same reasons or in the same ways. So there are certain groups, women, racial and ethnic minorities, members of the LGBTQ community, who are disproportionately targeted for their identity. And so what you can see in the graphic on my right, probably your left, is that women experience 3 times as much gender identity harassment as men, which will surprise no female scientists anywhere. African Americans and Latinos are experiencing more harassment than they were last year online. Asian Americans are experiencing more than double the harassment than they were in 2019 because of their race. Muslims and Jews are experiencing a great deal, by factors of 2 or 3 times more harassment than even last year, let alone before the internet was a thing. So I think it's important to understand this because it ties directly into issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in all kinds of fields, right? We are all having very overdue and much needed conversations about representation in our various respective fields. And if this issue disproportionately impacts some people over others and could drive them out of professions or drive them, into silence, it's a really big problem. And so, unfortunately, there are not very many studies about how this is playing out within fields. There are some studies, because it's been such an issue in journalism and the media, about how it's playing out in the media. And so, for example, a recent study from the Committee to Protect Journalists found that over 90% of female or non-binary journalists reported online harassment as the single biggest threat that they face in their professional life. And we at Penn did our own study in 2017, and we found that over 2/3 of the folks who had reported online harassment, who were writers and journalists in our study in this case, engaged in all kinds of self-censoring behavior, whether that involved, avoiding starting to write about certain topics, permanently deleting social media, temporarily deleting social media accounts or taking breaks from them. Some people stopped publishing and left their field altogether, which is a huge, huge problem. And it's a problem mostly because public discourse is increasingly playing out online. That is one of the most important spaces we have on social media platforms to share ideas and to exchange ideas. And so if there are whole groups of people who are being kept out of that space or pushed out of that space whenever they try to speak or threatened with their lives, we have to do something. And so what we did is, as Andy kindly pointed out, we spent a year building this digital resource called the Online Harassment Field Manual. We talked to psychologists, technologists, lawyers, a lot of people with firsthand experience of abuse. And it's really a comprehensive guide about what to do if this is happening to you, but also how to prepare yourself proactively to try to mitigate the damage before things get really bad, and how to take care of your mental health, and some legal considerations you can also keep in mind. As Andy mentioned, we have started doing, well, we haven't started, we've been doing for 2 years now. I've been traveling the country when traveling was still a thing, and doing kind of extensive engagements with newsrooms to help senior leadership in newsrooms figure out how to better support staff, and to help staff figure out how to defend themselves and one another from these attacks. And this is what a roadmap for one of my trainings looks like. We really cover the gamut. It's very dense. We talk a lot about the different things people are experiencing. And so far, I've primarily been in newsrooms and worked with professional associations of writers and journalists, but we also at Penn do a lot of work on campuses around free speech. And my colleague runs that program, and he's constantly coming to me telling me the degree to which online abuse is becoming a subject that everybody is talking about. It impacts academics, faculty, students, administrators, research assistants, and everybody in between. So it does seem to be sort of a moment when more than ever we have to discuss this issue. So I'm so grateful to you for bringing us together to talk about it, and I'll hand it back to you to bring in some of the other folks that you've brought for this conversation.
That's a great start. And I think one of the things you mentioned already that's really important to keep in mind is it's a set of capacities more than specific tools, because, as you say, the landscape is constantly shifting. So now I'm going to introduce everyone, not that it's an introduction for many, to Kate Marvel, who's a climate scientist here at Columbia and at NASA, who's been becoming a remarkably effective communicator online and an eloquent writer for Scientific American and elsewhere. She's done TED Talks. And here's Angela Rasmussen, who's a virologist at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health, who is deeply dug into the structure of this particular virus and many others that can pose mortal peril to the planet. It's great to have you both here. And Jacquelyn Gill, I'm going to bring her on in a second. I think her camera may be off or on. We'll find out. Jacquelyn, are you ready to come out? Here's Jacquelyn.
Just a static photo for now.
That's fine. It's great. Jacquelyn, I remember way back in March sending you a query. Hey, can we can we have a conversation online about how we navigate this moment? Because Jacquelyn, who's a paleoecologist at the University of Maine and a really great presence on social media and in public venues as well, has been working not just, I'd say it's pretty fair to say a big chunk of your communication online is not just communicating climate science, but it's communicating with your peers, trying to develop that sort of a coherent collaborative cohort around how to deal with things online. Great to have you all here. So I guess the first thing would be to have each of you, you don't have to go through a case study, but when you look at this toolkit and you think about how you've been dealing with these kinds of issues so far, what comes to mind? maybe we'll start with Angie, because you're so dug in right now in a way that's so real time. You're probably tweeting in spare seconds while you were sitting in the green room about COVID-19 realities. So what's your thinking when you hear about this?
I mean, all of those forms that Victoria was just talking about of online harassment, I was already familiar with prior to becoming more popular on social media than I am now. And, you know, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, because as a woman in science, I'm well aware of the many forms of harassment that we face just in our day-to-day, the course of our day-to-day work. Online provides really a lot of unique opportunities for strangers to harass you, which is not as common when you're at an academic conference, for example. Then you're dealing with a much smaller pool of people. When you're on Twitter, you know, pretty much anybody, if you have an unprotected account like I do, can chip in their 2 cents, and often they take all of the forms of reply guy and harasser that Victoria was just discussing. So, I mean, I've certainly had experienced personally some of those things. Fortunately, I haven't been doxxed, but I have been impersonated. I've been harassed. I've been, you know, sent all kinds of accusations, things to embarrass me, things to attempt to make me look bad in front of my colleagues. Publicly, and it's really difficult to deal with. Now, I have a pretty thick skin, and I have gotten used to this. So at this point, I try not to let that occupy too much of my mental real estate unless there's a direct threat made to me, in which case I have reported that to law enforcement and taken those types of steps. But now I pretty much just try to block and report everything that comes to me, at least on Twitter. If there is more involved harassment, if it spills over to harassing my family members, to, you know, saying that they know where I live, or they're going to actually bother me in person or bother me at work. I've had actually people email my boss. And so I've had to do other things besides blocking and reporting. But I'd say the main thing in my toolkit is to just pretty much deny those online harassers access to me. And by not allowing myself to engage with them, you know, it hopefully in some cases will get their accounts taken down or suspended, but at least it's not something that is causing me permanent sort of accumulative damage as these harassers are trying to chip away at me.
And do you feel, I guess you do, because you wouldn't be still on Twitter, that the upside is worth it? Like,
yeah, I do.
It seems hard sometimes to focus on the upside parts. Like, we're so busy defending and saying that's not quite right. And
there are a lot of upsides, and like especially during this pandemic, you know, it's a weird situation because I'm in Seattle, where I've been since March, since this is where my husband lives. So I haven't actually been back to my lab or my apartment in New York in 4 months. And this feels like something that I can do in addition to trying to get grant funding, and now I have a funded project, I'm writing up the paper, but this is something that I can actually do to contribute to the effort given my area of scientific expertise. A lot of people want to know what's going on. They don't know what to make of all the news, and there's a ton of misinformation out there. So it has been really good to have this medium that I can communicate with a lot of people very quickly, tell them, you know, this study doesn't really mean anything. This is a preprint, not a peer-reviewed paper. Here's how the virus infects cells, et cetera, et cetera. And I've gotten stuff back from just the general public thanking me for helping them to understand the situation a little bit better. I've also found that social media is actually a great forum for communicating with my peers, especially in adjacent fields such as epidemiology, infection prevention, public health policymakers, and so forth. It has actually provided new opportunities. I've become a PI in a completely different consortium project that I didn't even know existed before I met the PI of the entire project on Twitter. So there's definitely an upside. It's really good. I think I might let Jacqueline talk about that a little bit more, because she's, as you pointed out, has been extremely effective at facilitating communications between peers in science online. And I'd be curious also to hear how everybody else deals with, you know, taking the good and dealing with the bad.
Yeah, and one thing I want to do before we end and the hour is have a bit of a to-do list. I do think I'm going to try to see if we can work out some workshops here at Columbia. They don't have to just be Columbia specific, but this arena of public scientists seems to be a newish part of the landscape of people who could benefit from some of these tools and stuff. So Jacqueline, your thoughts in this? Again, I met you on Twitter, and I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, you've dealt with all kinds of stuff. You have a very brave and also accepting. You've dealt with a variety of people in ways that are, and cultures in ways that are constructive. But how are you doing?
Oh, well, I'm actually doing better than usual when it comes to sort of my online presence, and it's one of those interesting things where the curve, if you imagine a graph where one axis is sort of time or number of followers, and another axis is kind of happiness or satisfaction. There's this it's not linear, right? There are these dips and troughs and peaks and valleys. And one thing that really that I didn't expect. I mean, I never set out to have 90,000+ followers on Twitter. It's something that just happened in a lot of ways. But I didn't really expect these sort of changes in your relationship to the community as you hit different levels of followers. You sort of hit about 8,000 and things really kind of start changing at that point. And if you're someone like me who tends to be their whole self on Twitter, there are a lot of advantages to that. I think that's one of the reasons that I have such a large community of followers. I think it's because I'm not just a science content robot, right? I am my whole self. But one of the risks of that is that it can give people more fodder to attack you with. I can't necessarily even make a comment about something like tarot cards, which is pretty innocuous, without one of my trolls sort of grabbing onto that and running with it. I've also opened up about things like my experience with abortion or my mother dying, and some of the more aggressive people that have followed me off of Twitter and used other platforms to harass me have used those anecdotes as ways to just it's like a crack in your armor, right? They know where your vulnerable places are, and I share those vulnerable moments very deliberately. But there's always this risk, knowing that when you do that, when you share something about yourself, and you become a little bit open and vulnerable, that people will try to take advantage of that. So there are tools and things that I've done, or approaches I've taken to be more sustainable. And I appreciate, Andy, that you mentioned, and Angie, you reiterated that if at any point this trade-off feels as though it's not worth it, then I will stop doing this. But so my job, I feel like, is to come up with ways for me to be sustainable. And sometimes that means just choosing to engage in conversation less with people, which, so I feel like Twitter has become more of a broadcasting platform for me than a conversational space, which is sad on some levels. I miss that aspect. It also means that I use things like block lists. Twitter has made it harder and harder over time to use some of these tools to protect yourselves. Other people can no longer subscribe to my block list, which has hundreds of thousands of people on it, because I subscribe to some other automated lists. Like, for example, anybody who had the hashtag deplorable in their bio, or racist terminology. There's white supremacy block lists, and you can sort of add on to those and subscribe. A bunch of active women on Twitter have, we all kind of shared each other's block lists, so that, we're sort of crowdsourcing, blocking some of the harassment within our own community. And there are ways around those blocks. And it's really frustrating to have people who can still, who are blocked, tweet links to your tweets or pictures of your tweets, and direct their followers to harass you. And Twitter doesn't really care very much about those kinds of activities. That flies under the radar. But for the most part, using these tools, even though there are sometimes false positives, and I'll find myself accidentally blocking someone that I didn't mean to, like The Rock. I would never block The Rock. Who would do that? But once you fix it, it's all good. And honestly, I've actually found that since doing that, I've my time here has become less full of noise and less full of angry noise. But of course, there's still, the reply guys, there's, the other forms of harassment, but I sort of have developed, like Angie, a thick skin, which isn't to say it doesn't bother me, but at the same time, you sort of learn how to just let it, roll off after a certain point. For me, the really, the harder parts are the people who I would say the vast majority of folks are just, equal opportunity harassers. They just want to demean women and then jump on to the next woman that they can demean, right? But the people who I think are really the ones that are actually a lot harder, you can get those accounts blocked. I've had many of them, shut down, after reporting harassment. But, there's a handful of people out there that have made it their full-time job to give me a hard time and to get me to stop talking. And those people find other ways. They use other tools. They use Tor servers to send me emails or leave comments on sections of my blog or my website. Or they'll just operate kind of under the radar on Twitter and then just let their never-ending group of minions after you. And so those are the people who, they'll email my boss or not my boss, but my directors of my departments. Those are the sorts of things that are a little bit harder to deal with. I've been very fortunate that I have not been doxxed. So that's something that I'm always, just thinking about. It's in the back of my mind. And there are tools like Crash Override, which was started during Gamergate as a tool or a set of tools for people who have become the targets of online abuse. I'm aware of those tools. I use, two-factor authentication, and I, protect myself as much as I can. But there's only so much that you can do, and people who are really dedicated will find a way around it. And there's very little that you can do, especially if, they're using these tools to be anonymous on the internet.
Wow. Well, that idea of your community, having a community where you're sharing block lists or kind of assessing their effectiveness and stuff seems to be a really big part of how to survive. So I'm going to turn this over to Viktorya in a couple of minutes, and I might even step back into the green room to let you all talk to each other and ask questions and come up with some solutions. But Kate, I wanted to kind of get to you now in that sense of your learning curve and how you deal with this part of things. I'm going to just show a tweet you did recently that's kind of fun. America's climate change experts are sending sympathy and support. This is, the public health experts who've been drained and frustrated. That's a broad community. It's not just your climate community. That's the whole community.
Yeah. I mean, just watching, the virologists and the immunologists and the epidemiologists go through what we in the climate community have been going through for so long really kind of breaks my heart. And I want to give everybody a hug. And then I'm like, wait, don't give an infectious diseases person a hug right now. But it does really bother me. Like I don't have a thick skin. And I actually have made my peace with that. I kind of feel like my skin is fine. People shouldn't say these things. And it's okay to think this is wrong. I am actually, Jacqueline or Angie, I forget who, talked about peaks and troughs. I'm actually in a trough right now. So I'm taking a social media break. And I'm taking a social media break in large part because schools are closed and there's no daycare. And, we still have full-time jobs we have to get done. And that's crazy. But also because right now there is a pretty concerted harassment campaign going on, and my NASA email is being flooded with abuse. Fortunately, NASA has really stood behind me. I have got a great boss. Headquarters has been like, you know what, doing science is not a fireable offense at NASA. But I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt my feelings when I get anti-Semitic abuse. I get really sexist abuse. Started getting transphobic abuse, like people saying that you're not really a woman, you look like a man, you're too ugly to be a woman. It makes me very sad that there are people out there and this is their hobby. You know, like, why don't you take up bird watching? Why don't you do something else? But it just, on a deep level, it makes me very, very sad. I think I have, like, I've experienced really similar things to both Jacqueline and Angie. I've met great people online, and I think that aspect is really, really worth it. I also, you know, Twitter is not the real world, but Twitter is where journalists live. And so if you want to talk to the media, it's really, really helpful to have that Twitter presence, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also really important to sort of step back and say a lot of these things that are happening are not okay.
That point you just made about the Twitter being where journalists are and scientists who want to be effective at that interface of policy and science and making sure journalists get things a little less wrong is certainly one of the upsides, and that's what makes it. I do say to people, including journalists, it's part of the work. It is work. I mean, it may not be in your job description, but if you want to be a public scientist or a public communicator aiming at some objective, thinking of it as something you gird for, you wake up for, you have a certain mental state around, probably is a good practice. Although it doesn't, as you said, for all of you who've been attacked, and I've had my share, there is an emotional toll, and that it spills onto your kids and your spouse and the like too. So I'm going to turn this over to. Well, I just want to make sure that Viktorya has some time to ponder some of the input you've given. I might even step into the green room for a bit, just so you can talk amongst yourselves about, you know, what's missing in your individual universes, or what's an idea that you might want to contribute to a bin of tools that maybe aren't as evident yet to others.
I wanted to give Kate an opportunity. I know, Kate, you were about to say something, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to say that.
I had a question for you, actually. And it's a question about kind of, I think a lot about sort of amplification, and, you know, those of us who've been fortunate enough to amass like fairly large followings, I think it's really important to put forward other voices, you know, but I feel right now kind of reluctant sometimes to share, you know, here's an article somebody wrote that I think is fantastic, or check out this person's work, because I don't want to subject them to harassment. And so I was just curious, like, what thoughts you had about that.
Yeah, that's a tough question. You know, like I said, I spend a lot of time doing this work in newsrooms, and I have journalists who are afraid to spotlight their colleagues' work because they don't want to subject them to. So it's very parallel. I mean, I think, do you mind if I zoom out and then I'll come back to your question?
Please, yeah.
First, let me say that I'm really grateful to all three of you for talking publicly about this. It is an extremely exhausting, infuriating, frustrating, and kind of draining experience. And then to have to speak about it publicly is actually very courageous. And I'm really grateful, because I think it makes other people who are experiencing this feel like they're not alone, they're not crazy. And there's actually not enough conversations in every field that I've had any access to about this issue and the toll that it takes. So my first point is just to thank all three of you very much, not only for speaking about it, but for continuing to do the work that you're doing in the face of all of it. I will say that I do a lot of work around self-defense when it comes to this issue, because I think it's really important to empower people. But this should not, the burden of dealing with this cannot and should not always fall purely on the people who are being targeted for abuse. This is a much bigger issue. There is an enormous amount of work that the social media platforms are still not doing effectively or well to give people good tools. The block list feature, I have been having conversations about that feature and why it went away and is it coming back. You know, you can still do block lists, but you can't share them anymore. I'm hopeful it will come back in that capacity, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. And so we're doing a bunch of research right now, and I might individually reach out to all of you, if you don't mind, where we're actually figuring out what tools should exist that don't exist baked into the platforms that can help people navigate this better, and what exists that isn't working very well. And then having really in-depth conversations with the companies about that. So this is an issue with the platforms. This is an issue with employers. Like, there's not enough of an understanding. I mean, Kate, you mentioned that you were fortunate enough to have a really supportive and understanding employer and understanding managers. And that's critical, but a lot of folks don't. And even when folks are understanding in the sense that they will listen, they will try to help, there's actually, like, there should be structural support. Like, there should be intensive cybersecurity training for anyone who's going to have a public-facing profile. There should be subsidized or free various tools that exist online to help you reduce the private information that's floating around about you, which is very time-consuming, can be very expensive. You know, there should be access to legal counsel if you need it. There should be access to mental health care and support if the stuff is really taking a toll, which it often does. So I think there are structural issues, and I just really wanted to make that absolutely clear, not so much for the three of you who are living this all the time, but to anyone who's with us here today, that this is a problem that's bigger than the individuals who are perpetually on the receiving end of it. And then there's actually the piece about allyship, which is where I come back to Kate's question. There are no right answers about any of this stuff. And I generally tell people to trust their instincts and to always keep top of mind that usually when they are the subject of harassment campaigns or extensive abuse, it is a deliberate censorship tactic. Like, yes, it's somebody's full-time job or hobby because they have nothing better to do with their lives, but it's also actually usually because they want to push you offline, right? Their goal is to, they don't want women talking, they don't want, you know, scientists talking, and they want to intimidate folks enough that they basically give up and just can't deal with the bandwidth that it requires to keep speaking publicly. And I do think somehow knowing that helps, because you realize that you're dealing with like an aggressive actor who has an agenda, right? A lot of the time. And so my feeling about, you know, amplification, I feel like the Free Expression Organization program director in me would say that there is such an organized force of bad actors, and the force of people who are actually trying to make the internet a better place and support one another is also very powerful, but more diffuse. And so I feel like any kind of support folks can offer one another to amplify one another's work is a positive thing. But I totally take the practical point that you're making, that if you draw attention to someone else, they may then become the receiving end of abuse. So I would say in that case, if you know the person, DM them and just have a 2-minute chat about it. Chances are they'll tell you, actually, please keep promoting my work and advocating for me and amplifying my work. But if you ask, you'll kind of know, okay, well, they're not going into this. They're not gonna get blindsided, I've warned them. If you don't know the person, I think it's helpful to take a look at their Twitter account and see if this is most likely something they're dealing with too on a regular basis, especially if they're a woman who writes about science. But otherwise, I guess my unhelpful advice is to trust your instincts, right? Do whatever is going to feel the most empowering and the least damaging and bad for you. And that generally tends to be in my advice in the global sense, but in the specific sense, I have all kinds of very practical suggestions I can offer on all fronts. But so can I ask you folks sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I just have some thoughts to respond to all of those things, but if you have a specific question.
I want your thoughts. No. I want your thoughts. My question was going to be along the lines of your thoughts.
Oh, okay. All right. So, you know, there's a few things I wanted to touch on that have been brought up so far. The first one is I really wanted to appreciate Kate's point about not having a thick skin, because, you know, frankly, like, I feel like that's just something that I repeat to myself, because anytime I have ever said that this is upsetting or it bothers me, someone has weaponized that against me, and it amplifies the abuse and it gets worse. And so it means that, you know, we have to posture constantly. We're not allowed to talk about how this hurts. And Andy's comment about how it spills over into our families, like, there have been times where I have been sort of trapped on, you know, me with my screen. And, you know, he's looked at me and he said, like, why are you letting these people take something from us? Like, this is time that we could be spending together. And he understands, you know, on one level that, of course, it's not like I'm, you know, yes, I'm making a conscious choice to engage or deal with this problem or show people that this is what's happening. But it just feels like we don't have tools. We don't have any recourse, because, you know, someone's saying just block them or ignore them, or, you know, occasionally, you know, 99% of the time I will do that. But if I do retweet someone and say, look at this, or can you help me get this account taken down? I'll get 57 people saying, don't feed the trolls, as though I this is not my life and I don't deal with this all the time and I'm new here, which just feels very dismissive. But B, it's like, any of you who are familiar with plants, trolls are autotrophs. They make their their energy from the sun or whatever, because they don't need to be fed to reproduce. They do it all on their own. And I have not found that, I found that, engaging with them can make it worse sometimes. Sometimes it makes them go away. But at the end of the day, it just feels like we don't have tools, we don't have options. The platforms that benefit from us being here and creating community and content don't seem to care about these problems. They don't really protect us. So many people think having a blue check next to your name makes a difference. I think it actually makes it worse. You get no benefits. You just become more of a target. And I think the other important thing to remember is that they are very well organized. There are people, I was not joking when I said it's like a full-time job. We're doing this on top of everything else we do. Some of these people seem to have literally nothing else to do other than organize these campaigns of hate against people. They have websites dedicated to pointing people at us and sharing our information and taking screenshots and directing folks to our responses. Whether those are TERFs or climate deniers or white supremacists, like they have infrastructure and they have time and energy. And that's something that those of us who are doing other kinds of productive work just can't compete with. And so I think that's like the first barrier. If we cannot expect these platforms like Twitter or Facebook or whatever, Instagram, to actually care about creating, safe and productive spaces for us, what's our recourse? We cannot achieve the same level of organization and dedication that they have because we're out here doing this work on top of all the other work we're doing.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that, Jacqueline. And I mean, I'll give you an example of how inadequate social media tools are based on what happened last week. Twitter, as you know, probably got hacked. And I have been told by multiple of my friends who are in security that I need to be very careful about my password, which I already knew, but just because right now, like virologists and public health people are actually being actively targeted. I do have a blue check and I have 150,000 followers. My account would be very attractive to take over for some people. So as soon as I heard about the Twitter hack, I immediately changed my password. Twitter went ahead and locked me out of my account for 2 days after that because their own internal mechanisms of dealing with this hack were so inadequate. While I was gone, people were jumping in to basically take advantage of my absence, my inability to even see anything that people were commenting in my replies or tweeting at me. I couldn't do anything about it because I couldn't even get into my account. And, I came back to a whole bunch of accounts that I had to block and report. And Jacqueline, what you just said about, your husband saying, why are you letting these people take this time away from you? It is work. It becomes work dealing with these mobs of people. And no matter how thick your skin is, I mean, that's my coping mechanism. It's certainly not the only coping mechanism, and it's not going to work for everybody. No matter how thick your skin is, though, that burden of having to do that work is exhausting, and it's emotionally damaging, and it takes away from the things that you love to do, like spend time with your family, for example. And it's really, it really is incumbent on some of the social media companies to take this more seriously. The other thing is when I report something on Twitter now, I report that it's a fake account because I think that's going to get more of a response from Twitter than if I post that this is abusive or harassing. Unless somebody has made a direct threat against me or doxed me, which has never happened so far, reporting abuse and harassment, oftentimes I'll get an email back sometimes weeks later saying, oh, Twitter reviewed this and they didn't find any violations of the Twitter user policy. And that's just not okay because of the emotional damage. And I think you discussed this, Viktorya, about how there really isn't those mental health safety nets either. This can do real damage to people, especially the way it accumulates. these little cuts all can add up. And if there's no resources for emotional or mental health support, there are no resources for reliably getting one of these trolls who, as Jacqueline said, are very organized, are very good at what they do. And their goal is to really get you to stop speaking, to get you off of Twitter, to get you to fade into the background. It is a form of censorship. So it really is incumbent on some of these social media companies to step up their efforts to make Twitter and social media a safer place for all of us. We shouldn't have to be dealing with this.
I love
the
Sorry.
Keep going. I'm
no,
just
I mean,
saying
the
hi.
point I was making about how I was, in fact, I was deeply moved by what Kate was saying, and I had this conversation with many, many people, and no matter how thick a skin anyone has, it takes a toll. And that's why I say it's a systemic issue that's much bigger than the individuals on the receiving end of it. And it is definitely a major issue in terms of the tech companies taking responsibility and doing a better job, but it's actually also an issue for employers, because increasingly so many of us, there is an expectation, even if it's unspoken in some cases, that you effectively have to have a prominent social media presence to do your job. But if you're going to put yourself at risk that way, there needs to be some kind of system of support, and that involves access to professional mental health care, and understanding that you're going to have to take time away because it's just drives people insane, and also like actual resources, right? Like, here's a service that deletes all of your private information offline every month, all the time, in real time. That service is very expensive, so we're going to pay for that service for you. So that kind of stuff is not happening. Like, we all got online, way before any institutions caught up with what it means for all of us to try to be doing our jobs online. And I mean that even pre-COVID pandemic, right? Like, I'm talking about before.
Oh, yeah.
So, and now it's just exacerbated. Kate, you were going to jump in.
I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Distract you.
No. I was actually going to say, like, I love this emphasis on systemic solutions and institutional solutions, because I think for so long it's just been, don't feed the trolls, or don't say that, or, this thing that got taken wildly out of context. Like, maybe it was your fault for saying that thing in the first place. An example is, if you say something like, all models are wrong, but some models are useful, which is one of my favorite quotes about scientific modeling. Some troll is going to chop that off and say, climate scientist Kate Marvel says all models are wrong. She admits it. And then, that'll just take on a life of its own. And instead of saying, oh, hey, maybe you shouldn't have said that, or maybe you should have had the ability to anticipate the bad faith arguments that get weaponized against you, I really love the emphasis on what are the systemic solutions, what should institutions do, what should the scientific community do. I worry that for so long there's been kind of this just world fallacy where bad things don't happen to good people. And so if something like this is happening, you must have done something to provoke it. And I actually don't think that being disliked by Nazis is a character flaw. But I worry, and I have gotten the sense sometimes in the wider scientific community, there's a sense of like, oh, well, she's controversial. And, sometimes she's not controversial. Like, I don't think Jacqueline is controversial. I think Jacqueline is amazing, but bad people don't like her. And so, I worry. I'm really, really happy about the focus on systemic solutions, but I also worry that the scientific community, which is kind of fundamentally very conservative, dominated by a specific group of people, I worry about that sort of nebulous impact on people's careers.
I'd also
Which is
like
part of why I think
go
that
ahead.
there needs to be way more conversation about this, because it's like, how many decades was sort of, we all know sexual harassment happens everywhere in every one of our workplaces. It's also a systemic issue. The internet amplifies issues that we've been dealing with for hundreds of years, basically. So I think it is really imperative, and I don't mean that to put emphasis or pressure on people who are already dealing with this all the time, but there needs to be conversations like this one, but like really in very serious ways in academia at all levels of power about what it means to effectively insist someone exists online, but not understand what that environment actually feels and looks like. Jacqueline, sorry.
Yeah, no,
it's hard
okay.
to tell when you're speaking because I can't see you.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. Thanks for making that space. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about a really wonderful example that I'm using wonderful in scare quotes that's going on in the comments section of this discussion right now, where we have people who don't seem to understand the difference between disagreement and harassment or abuse, right? Having a disagreement about science or scientific ideas is not the same thing as, mocking me on the evening of my mother's death and telling me that at least she managed her weight, unlike I did, right? Having a disagreement about science is not the same thing as being a white supremacist. And white supremacist and Nazi, those are words that have real meanings. And we are using the real meanings of those words to talk about real people who have those beliefs. We're not just using those to dismiss people that we happen to be having a scientific disagreement about. And so the people don't understand the difference between, or they pretend not to understand the difference, and then accuse us of being oversensitive, right? They don't understand the difference between quibbling about RCP 8.5 as a climate scenario and whether or not I'm going to die fat, ugly, and alone, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, but the latter topic is none of your fucking business, and it's not up for discussion. So, this is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. So thank you so much, Charles Rotter. I really appreciate you, validating my points with such lovely examples.
Yeah, I see that there. We have about 10 minutes left. We can go a little bit longer if anyone has the capacity to do that. I do want to articulate right away that there's sessions we can do. I'm sure I can find funding at Columbia to do standardize some of this. As Victoria said, even within Columbia, these are discussions that are just new. We just started this Thriving Online series 5 weeks ago with a university-wide convening around how to thrive online. And my hypothesis is thriving online ? Really? Yes, I think there's a yes, but it does require work. It does require tools. It requires understanding that this is a big part of the landscape within science too, as Kate and others have said. And I've seen this in online discussions of science. Everyone at NSF and other places are talking convergence, right? We're talking about fields getting together in ways that they didn't before. There are grant tracks specifically for that. And if people are not, if we're not able to utilize the internet, the connectivity that can happen and get us out of our walls, and here we are, we're in a wall-free environment right now. We could talk to anybody right now. Then we're going to impede the things that universities and scientific enterprises are all about. So I'm all about normalizing this. And that's why I thought the field manual, I just want to show it here again. We don't have the time to go through all this today, but prepare for harassment, respond to harassment, self-care, legal considerations, seeking support, learning more. This is what Columbia, NASA, or any kind of organization in this arena of public knowledge in a time of crisis has to be really utilizing this. So I guess I have a quick question for Victoria. There's one of you, right?
Yes.
That's a problem to me.
Can I tell you how there's very few people who do any kind of training in online abuse and globally. I know the handful of people who do this work, and we're all like, right. There's not enough of us. We can't keep up with the demand. In a way, I'm trying to tackle this problem both micro and macro at the same time, which is why I keep talking about the systemic issues. But a lot of the training I do is for institutions and individuals, because you can't, the systemic stuff takes a lot of time, right? And there's a lot more conversation about this issue than there was even 3 or 4 years ago. But we are so far from a point where we're having enough of the kinds of conversations, let alone giving people enough of the kinds of resources they need. I feel a little bit bad because I feel like, I was really hammering with the systemic piece, and I don't want to leave people here without any kind of concrete in the moment guidance. I think that you've probably gleaned what our other speakers have talked about, the things they've had to teach themselves effectively. My issue is that people have to teach themselves the stuff on the fly. They don't get any kind of proactive support before they get out onto these spaces and start getting hammered and then have to figure it out, and they're smart, so they figure it out as best they can. But, I don't talk about prevention. When I do these trainings, I talk about preparation, because it is very difficult if you are using social media to prevent this stuff from happening. And there's a certain point at which I would not even, like when you think about attempts to say, use machine learning to proactively delete content, there are so many ways that goes wrong all the time, even now, that it's a difficult area when you get into prevention. And there's actually nothing you as an individual can do to prevent people from coming after you. But there are things you can do very concretely, which Jacqueline was talking about, which everyone here has been talking about, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of protecting your accounts. There are a lot of things built into the social media platforms, tools that people don't know about, because the social media platforms bury them and nobody ever gets any training in how to use those tools. And then when you're on the receiving end of it, I think some of the most important things to do are to be able to name the thing that's happening to you, so that you can make a very concrete distinction between criticism, which all of us are able to distinguish between doxing and sexual harassment and hate speech and all the other beautiful and amazing things that we get subjected to. And so most of us are not at all unclear about which is which. And the reason I go through definitions is because they are very distinct. Like, what I'm talking about are abusive tactics. They are not critique. And it's very, very difficult to confuse the two unless you're willfully trying. Sorry, go on, Andy.
Well, I was just going to say one thing that's important is that little conversation that's going on in the text box is typing. And what we're doing here is face-to-face. And when I was doing my .earth blog around 10 years ago, I saw this comment thread being pretty tangled and brittle. And I realized you could embed a YouTube video there. So I said to my .earth readers, hey, hello out there, post a little greeting to the other people here as a video greeting. And I tried to build this idea of a visual face on top of the words. I would love to have a conversation, a constructive one, with people about some of the issues that are being raised in the comment thread by folks who are typing, but it can't happen typing. And I think that feeling like what has to happen, not just, to me, one of the defense tactics is not so much defense, but getting creative about how to respond to people in different ways and when not to respond. Like a textual back and forth is fundamentally different than a face-to-face back and forth.
Well, there was actually a point I wanted to make about that. There's actually a phenomenon that's called the online disinhibition effect. And there's a theory basically that the anonymity provided by the internet gives people the sense, like, how do I put it? The social mores that would otherwise maybe inhibit you from abusing someone to their face completely dissipate when you don't see the damage of what you're doing and you can hide behind an anonymous screen and nobody knows who you are. And so it's actually it's part of what the structural problem is, right? That you essentially, that the systems kind of create even more space for this stuff to be happening.
Yeah. So I'd love it if each of you, we're kind of at the end here. We can go again a few minutes past 2 if you can, before I have to get back to my dentist. But if, so maybe some closing thoughts on next steps. I do want to, other than us developing some workshops that would be more Zoom-like, what would each of you see as something you've jotted down today that we can do next?
So, or I would also say, or a tip that works, something that you do that works well for you, that other people can take advantage of. Sorry, go ahead, Jacqueline.
I just I wanted to ask a quick question about to Victoria, actually, about some of the systemic change. So I've been involved in an NIH working group that's designed to eliminate all forms of sexual misconduct and harassment, and that we've extended that to apply as well to online bullying, in-person bullying, and all the different forms of harassment that people might face. But the problem I've seen is that while NIH and a lot of the institutions who are represented on the committee, they are stakeholders and they profess to be, dedicated to this, but there's a lot of resistance just in how the system works, in terms of what they're actually going to do. besides training. And I'm curious, as you've been training institutions, presumably high up decision-making, powerful people at these institutions, what kind of follow-through are they doing? Like, how effective is the training? Not in the sense that you're not training them effectively, but how receptive are they to actually living like what you've trained them to do? Because I think my observation has been that this has been the real problem. Everybody's super enthusiastic to change this. They recognize it's a problem. That we made recommendations for the NIH to start, defunding people who sexually harass their graduate students or their colleagues. And we made the recommendation, but the implementation is where we get a lot of, oh no, this doesn't work like that. It's very slow. Like, this is a process. And I'm like, how can this be a process when this is something you've never actually addressed before? I'm just curious how much of that, because I think that implementing real systemic change, you have to overcome some of these institutional barriers. And there is just a lot of built-in resistance in the system. And I'm completely down to help however I can to overcome those types of barriers. But I think it's going to take some real concerted effort on all of our parts to actually do that, as well as, the institutional officials who are actually in the positions of power to make these decisions. So I'm just curious. My final thoughts are kind of like, I'd like to know what you think about all of that and what your experience has been.
That's all. Yeah. No, let me offer a couple of very concrete thoughts. So I think number one, there needs to be surveys happening in academia across fields about the impact that this has, because we started doing that in journalism and media a couple of years ago. And then it gets much harder to argue, well, is this systemic? In what ways is this working? Is it really pushing people out when you have data, right? Like to be able to say, actually, like, look at all the people who are getting pushed out of the field, people you really, really want to stay in the field and to be speaking. So I think doing some kind of sort of research within even, certain disciplines about the impact that abuse is having on people's ability to speak and who it's impacting more is really important. I have seen folks very effectively in newsrooms collect screenshots and evidence of the kind of stuff that's happening to them and literally sit down in a meeting and slide it over and be like, what would you do if someone threatened to murder all of your family? Would you be able to keep talking online? And I don't mean this to be glib. I'm quite serious. Like, bringing visible, hard evidence, not just conversations about it, but like, look at what we're dealing with. What are you putting in place? And then I would say part of what I think needs to start happening is that it's been a lot of individuals trying to put pressure on companies and nonprofits. But I think if really, really wealthy, really powerful institutions like universities started to put more pressure, that would help a lot. And, government agencies would also help, although I know that's trickier, right? For myriad reasons that I won't get into right now. But, and then I think some of it is really just support. Like, it's going to be impossible to get to a point where there is no harassment online of any kind, right? In my opinion, I think that's going to be very, very difficult, at least for several years until machine learning improves in terms of detection and there's less implicit bias happening there. But providing sort of structures of support around people to make sure that even when they are on the receiving end of this stuff, they have help, they're not alone, is also something that, but how to overcome, over a century or several centuries of kind of implicit patriarchy and racism and sexism in institutions, I don't know. That's above my pay grade.
Well, this has been a great, I do see this as like chapter one, or maybe this is the introduction before chapter one to what has to be a sustained exploration of this, some of which can be online and public like this in widecast. The good thing about these conversations is they get archived right away. We can send them to others and try to build a community. Internally at organizations like Columbia, the Earth Institute, what I'm trying to do with the initiative on communication and sustainability is create a network within and among all the universities' elements and compartments, so that we can create a communicative culture. And that culture has to be self-sustaining. It has to be resilient. Susie Moser, who's come from climate adaptation work, she's doing a whole body of work on what she calls, how do you build the adaptive mind? She's talking there about dealing with climate resilience. But that same adaptive mind has to be applied in a case like this too. How do we deal with the information environment, not just the physical environment of storms? We have an information environment full of storminess right now. So we have to kind of call it quits here. I think we're not calling it quits at all. I hope we can reconvene and find ways to go forward in this. I do like, if any of you want to say one final quick thing, that'd be great. Jacqueline from up in University of Maine, great to have you here. I'm way overdue to pass through Maine. We're going to be up there this summer to see my mother-in-law. Maybe finally we can, at a distance, say hi. Do you have a last parting thought?
I would just say that until the institutions and individuals behind this kind of behavior, or who prop up this behavior, will actually do the right thing, it's up to us to, unfortunately, find the ways that we can to be sustainable. And sometimes that just means creating a sense of community, finding other people who are experiencing these issues, and sharing information, and even just support with each other as much as possible to normalize that this is real, it's wrong, and we need to do something about it.
And Kate, a last thought.
I love the journalists who are doing a great job trying to get this information out there. I love the scientists who are putting themselves out there to kind of tell the truth. And I think it's really important to understand that none of us is alone in this. And just to keep expressing that really deep, profound gratitude for all these people doing this amazing work in the face of an onslaught. So if any journalists are watching, thank you. If any other scientists are watching, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, community is a key thing here.
I second that wholeheartedly.
Thank you, Viktorya Vilk from PEN America, for coming into a sort of a new universe for you after dealing with these kinds of trainings for authors and journalists. It's pretty clear there's a very big landscape of folks who can benefit from what you're doing, and I'm here to amplify and spread and iterate as much as I can. So just have to conclude with a little boilerplate. Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration the last 50 years. That's what scientists called it in 2015. And of course, now we have this great pause that's enforced upon us by the virus that Angie is digging in on. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide. Get in touch with me with ideas. Look at the scrolling info at the bottom here, which you can look at once we're done. And stay in touch. On Wednesday, we have another session on a very different topic on sustainable cities in Africa and Israel. Friday is very relevant. World Health Organization representatives will be with me here for our Friday 1 p.m. Sustain What webcast on the infodemic and the culmination of their 2-week meeting of world experts on what's called the emerging field of infodemiology, meaning this dynamic landscape of information and disinformation. So thank you all for being here today, especially to my guests, to Kate and to Angie and to Jacqueline and to Viktorya, sorry. And
Don't
thank
worry,
you
it
again.
happens all the time.
Thank you again, and have a good day. Stay cool, stay sane, stay safe.
Everyone.